The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape of Iqaluit as King Charles III and Queen Camilla stepped off the royal aircraft. The crisp Arctic air hit their faces immediately, a stark contrast to the mild autumn weather they had left behind in London just hours earlier. This was their first official visit to Canada's Northern Territories as the reigning monarchs, and the significance of the moment was not lost on either of them. Charles pulled his heavy coat tighter around his shoulders as he surveyed the welcoming committee that had gathered on the small airstrip. Local officials, dressed in their finest formal, were mixed with practical winter clothing, stood alongside members of the Inuit community who had traveled from surrounding settlements to witness this historic occasion. The king had specifically requested that this visit focus on understanding and celebrating indigenous culture rather than following the typical ceremonial protocols that usually dominated royal tours. Camilla smiled warmly as children from the local school waved small British and Canadian flags, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. She had spent weeks preparing for this journey, reading about Inuit traditions, learning basic phrases in Inuktitut, and studying the complex history between the Crown and Canada's Indigenous peoples. The Queen Consort understood that this visit carried weight beyond simple diplomacy. It was an opportunity to bridge cultures and demonstrate genuine respect for traditions that had thrived in this harsh environment for thousands of years. The couple was greeted by Mary Killick T., the mayor of Iqaluit, whose grandmother had been one of the last generation to live entirely on the land before the establishment of permanent settlements. Mary's weathered hands shook theirs with genuine warmth as she explained the planned itinerary in both English and Inuktitut, with her granddaughter serving as translator for the more complex cultural explanations. As they made their way to the waiting vehicles, Charles noticed the curious blend of modern and traditional elements that characterized the small Arctic city. Snowmobiles parked next to pickup trucks, while traditional kamiks, sealskin boots, were worn alongside modern winter gear. Solar panels gleamed on rooftops of buildings that were elevated on stilts to prevent the permafrost from melting. This was a community that had successfully adapted to changing times while maintaining its cultural identity. Their first stop was the Nunata Sunakatanjit Museum, where elder Annie Kanguk waited to share stories of her people's history. At 87 years old, Annie represented a living link to the old ways, having been born in an igloo and raised on the land before the government's resettlement policies brought her family to the community. Her eyes sparkled with intelligence and humor as she prepared to introduce the royal couple to aspects of Inuit culture they had only read about in briefing documents. The museum's modest interior was filled with artifacts that told the story of survival and adaptation in one of the world's most challenging environments. Intricate carvings made from whalebone and soapstone lined the walls, while traditional clothing made from caribou hide and sealskin demonstrated the ingenious ways the Inuit had learned to thrive in temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees. Charles examined a traditional snow knife used for building igloos, marveling at the elegant simplicity of its design. The tool had remained essentially unchanged for generations because it had achieved perfect functionality through centuries of refinement. This attention to practical innovation resonated with the king's own interests in sustainable design and environmental adaptation. Camilla was drawn to a display of traditional women's clothing, particularly the beautiful amatiks, parkas, that featured large hoods designed to carry babies. Elder Kanguk explained how these garments represented not just protection from the elements, but also the central role of women in ensuring the survival and continuity of Inuit culture. The intricate beadwork and careful stitching demonstrated artistic traditions that had been passed down through generations of women working together during the long Arctic nights. As they moved through the museum, both Charles and Camilla began to understand that they were not simply observing artifacts, but learning about a sophisticated culture that had developed complex solutions to challenges that would have defeated most other societies. The Inuit had created sustainable hunting practices, developed intricate social structures for sharing resources during difficult times, and maintained oral traditions that preserved knowledge across centuries. The couple spent nearly an hour in the museum, asking detailed questions and listening intently to Elder Kanguk's explanations. Their genuine interest clearly pleased their hosts, who had grown accustomed to official visitors who rushed through cultural presentations without truly engaging with the material. Charles's background in environmental conservation led to particularly animated discussions about traditional knowledge of weather patterns and animal behavior. As they prepared to leave the museum, Elder Kanguk mentioned that the community had prepared a special cultural presentation for later in the day. She smiled mysteriously as she explained that they would experience something that few outsiders had ever witnessed, a demonstration of traditional Inuit throat singing by two of the community's most accomplished practitioners. Neither Charles nor Camilla had any idea what to expect from this traditional art form, but both were eager to learn more about this unique aspect of Inuit culture that had survived despite decades of cultural suppression. The community center buzzed with excitement as word spread that the royal couple would witness something truly special. Throat singing, known locally as Kadajak, had been practiced by Inuit women for countless generations before residential schools and cultural suppression policies nearly drove it to extinction. The revival of this ancient art form represented a broader renaissance of Inuit culture that had been quietly growing throughout the Arctic for the past several decades. Siku Kanguk, granddaughter of Elder Annie Kanguk, nervously adjusted her traditional clothing as she prepared for the performance. At 28 years old, she was part of a new generation of young Inuit women who were reclaiming cultural practices that their grandmothers had been forbidden to teach their children. Siku had learned Kadajak not in childhood, as tradition would have dictated, but as a university student studying indigenous languages in Montreal, where she connected with other young Inuit women who were rediscovering their heritage. Her performance partner, Tepeza Alice, had arrived that morning from Pangnirtung, a small community several hundred kilometers away. Tepeza, at 45, represented the bridge generation, old enough to have learned fragments of traditional songs from elderly relatives who still remembered the old ways, but young enough to be part of the cultural revival movement that was spreading throughout Nunavut. The two women had been practicing together for months, preparing for various cultural events throughout the territory. Their repertoire included traditional hunting songs, games that had entertained children during long winter nights, and ceremonial pieces that had once been performed during important community gatherings. Each song carried specific meanings and told stories about life on the land, relationships between humans and animals, and the spiritual belief that had sustained Inuit communities through countless generations of hardship and joy. Charles and Camilla entered the community center to find it filled with local residents of all ages. Children sat cross-legged on the floor in front, their eyes wide with anticipation. Teenagers who might normally have shown little interest in traditional culture had put aside their phones to witness something they knew was rare and special. Elders sat in chairs along the walls, their faces showing pride and satisfaction at seeing their culture celebrated and shared with distinguished visitors. The setup for throat singing was deceptively simple. Siku and Tepeza needed no instruments, no elaborate staging, no complex sound systems. They simply stood facing each other, close enough that their breath could mingle, their eyes locked in the intense concentration that Kadajak required. The art form was as much about the relationship between the two performers as it was about the sounds they would create together. Elder Kanguk stood to provide context for the performance, explaining that throat singing had traditionally been practiced by women during the long Arctic winter nights. It served multiple purposes: entertainment during the dark months when outdoor activities were limited, a way to strengthen bonds between women in the community, and a method for teaching young girls important cultural values and stories. The competitive aspect of the art form, where performers would try to outlast each other or maintain increasingly complex rhythms, had made it both a skill to master and a source of friendly rivalry among participants. The elder also explained that each throat singing session was unique, created in the moment through the interaction between the performers. Unlike written music, Kadajak relied on intuition, breath control, and the ability to read subtle cues from one's partner. This made every performance a small miracle of communication and cooperation, requiring trust and synchronization that went far beyond simply making sounds together. As Siku and Tepeza took their positions, the room fell completely silent. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that they were about to witness something sacred and important. The two women closed their eyes briefly, centering themselves and connecting with each other's energy before beginning their performance. The first sounds that emerged were unlike anything Charles and Camilla had ever heard. Low, guttural tones seemed to come from deep within the women's chests, while higher notes danced above them in complex harmonies that appeared to defy the limitations of human vocal cords. The rhythm was hypnotic and constantly shifting, with each performer building upon the sounds created by her partner in an intricate musical conversation. What made the performance particularly mesmerizing was the way the sounds seemed to tell a story without words. The audience could hear the wind across the tundra in the breathy undertones, the call of geese migrating overhead in the higher pitches, and the rhythm of footsteps across snow-covered ground in the percussive elements that the women created using their tongues and throats. Charles found himself leaning forward in his chair, completely absorbed by the complexity and beauty of the performance. His background in classical music had not prepared him for this utterly different approach to creating harmony and rhythm. The mathematical precision required to maintain the intricate patterns while responding to a partner's innovations struck him as requiring a level of musical sophistication that rivaled any conservatory training. Camilla was equally captivated, though her response was more emotional than analytical. The intimate nature of the performance, with the two women standing so close that they shared breath and rhythm, reminded her of the deep bonds between women that transcended cultural boundaries. She could see in their faces the concentration and trust that made this art form possible, and she began to understand why throat singing had been such an important part of traditional Inuit women's lives. As the performance continued, the complexity increased. Siku and Tepeza began incorporating more challenging techniques, including the imitation of animal sounds and environmental phenomena. Their voices created the impression of wind through ice caves, the cracking of sea ice in spring, and the haunting calls of Arctic wildlife. The audience remained completely silent, afraid that any sound might break the spell being woven by the two performers. The throat singing performance had been building in intensity for nearly 10 minutes when something unexpected happened. Tepeza, in attempting to create a particularly complex sound that mimicked a seal surfacing through breathing holes in the ice, produced a noise that was so perfectly absurd it caught everyone off guard. The sound emerged as a combination of deep bass note and what could only be described as a mechanical hiccup, followed immediately by a high-pitched whistle that seemed to come from nowhere. Siku, who had been concentrating intensely on maintaining her part of the harmony, broke character completely. Her eyes flew open, and she looked directly at Tepeza with an expression of surprised delight. The sound had been so unexpected and so perfectly timed that both women began to smile, even as they tried to maintain the serious concentration that throat singing typically required. In traditional Kadajak performances, breaking into laughter was not uncommon. In fact, it was often considered part of the game-like aspect of the art form. Performers would sometimes deliberately try to make each other laugh by incorporating silly sounds or by making funny faces while maintaining their vocalizations. The ability to make one's partner break concentration while continuing to perform was considered a sign of skill and creativity. What happened next was a cascade of barely suppressed giggles that began to affect the sounds the two women were producing. Tepeza, realizing that her seal impression had caused Siku to smile, decided to lean into the moment. She began exaggerating the mechanical aspects of the sound, making it even more ridiculous while somehow managing to keep it within the rhythm and structure of their performance. The audience, which had been sitting in respectful silence, began to sense the shift in the performance's tone. Children started to giggle as they recognized that something funny was happening, even if they couldn't quite identify what it was. The teenagers began to grin, appreciating the playful turn the serious cultural presentation had taken. Even the elders began to smile, remembering similar moments from throat singing sessions of their youth. Charles and Camilla, who had been maintaining the polite attention expected of royal guests at a cultural demonstration, found themselves completely caught off guard by the sudden shift in atmosphere. The king, who had been studying the technical aspects of the performance with scholarly interest, suddenly realized that the two women were having genuine fun, and that their laughter was becoming part of the art form itself. Camilla was the first to react visibly, as Siku attempted to respond to Tepeza's silly seal sounds with an equally ridiculous imitation of a walrus, complete with exaggerated breathing that made her cheeks puff out comically. The queen consort's carefully maintained royal composure began to crack. A small snort of laughter escaped before she could stop it, which she immediately tried to cover by pressing her hand to her mouth. The sound of Camilla's suppressed laughter seemed to give permission for others in the audience to respond more openly. What had begun as polite cultural appreciation was rapidly transforming into genuine communal joy. The children were now laughing openly, the teenagers were grinning broadly, and even the most formal community officials were beginning to smile. Siku, emboldened by the audience's response and her partner's continued silliness, decided to escalate the playful competition. She began incorporating sounds that were clearly inspired by modern life rather than traditional Arctic animals. Her impression of a snowmobile having trouble starting was so accurate that several audience members who owned snowmobiles began laughing in recognition. This modern twist on traditional throat singing was not unprecedented, but it was rarely performed in formal cultural presentations. The fact that the two women felt comfortable enough to incorporate contemporary elements into their performance for royal guests spoke to their confidence in both their abilities and their audience's appreciation. Tepeza responded with what appeared to be her interpretation of a satellite phone, receiving poor reception in a blizzard. The series of beeps, static sounds, and frustrated attempts to establish connection was so recognizable to anyone who had lived in the Arctic that the entire audience erupted in knowing laughter. Charles, who had initially been trying to maintain proper royal decorum, found himself completely disarmed by the creativity and humor of the performance. His knowledge of the challenges of Arctic communication technology made Tepeza's interpretation particularly amusing to him. The fact that these women could incorporate such contemporary references into an ancient art form while maintaining its essential character struck him as brilliantly innovative. The king's first audible chuckle came when Siku began what could only be described as her impression of a polar bear discovering a garbage can behind a northern community center. The combination of curiosity, determination, and ultimate frustration that she conveyed through throat singing techniques was so perfectly observed that Charles found himself genuinely impressed by her comedic timing as well as her vocal skills. Camilla was by now making no attempt to hide her amusement. The queen consort was known for her genuine laugh, and she was clearly delighting in this unexpected turn toward humor in what she had anticipated would be a solemn cultural education. Her laughter seemed to encourage the performers to become even more creative in their interpretations. The community center had by now transformed from a formal presentation space into something more like a family gathering where everyone was sharing in a moment of spontaneous joy. The cultural barriers between the royal visitors and their Inuit hosts had dissolved in the face of universal human appreciation for absurdity and creativity. Elder Kanguk, watching from her chair along the wall, smiled with deep satisfaction. This was exactly how throat singing was supposed to work, not as a museum piece to be observed reverently, but as a living art form that brought people together in laughter and community. The fact that it had achieved this effect with visitors from another culture entirely proved the universal appeal of shared humor and creativity. The moment that would become legendary in the small community of Iqaluit occurred when Tepeza decided to attempt her most ambitious sound creation yet. She had noticed that both Charles and Camilla were now laughing openly, and she wanted to create something that would acknowledge their presence while maintaining the playful spirit that had taken over the performance. Drawing upon her observations of the royal couple's arrival that morning, Tepeza began crafting what could only be interpreted as her impression of a very formal, very British person attempting to start a conversation in Inuktitut while wearing too many layers of winter clothing. The sound she produced somehow managed to convey politeness, confusion, and bulkiness all at the same time, complete with what sounded like muffled apologies from inside a heavy parka hood. The accuracy of this observation was so perfect that several community members who had witnessed the morning's arrival began laughing immediately. Charles, recognizing himself in the gentle parody, was the first to burst into full, uncontrolled laughter. The king's reaction was so genuine and hearty that it surprised everyone, including himself. Camilla, seeing her husband's complete abandonment of royal protocol, felt her own restraint completely dissolve. The queen consort's laughter was infectious, a warm, generous sound that filled the community center and seemed to invite everyone present to join in the moment of shared joy. Her response encouraged Siku to begin her own interpretation of a very proper lady attempting to walk gracefully across icy ground while wearing inappropriate footwear. What followed was a period of approximately 3 minutes that community members would talk about for years to come. The two throat singers, feeding off the energy of their laughing audience, began an improvised comedy routine that maintained all the technical skill of traditional Kadajak, while incorporating observations about cross-cultural encounters that were both gentle and brilliantly funny. Charles found himself laughing so hard that tears began to form in his eyes. The king, who was accustomed to formal presentations and carefully scripted cultural exchanges, was experiencing something entirely different. The throat singers were not performing for him in the traditional sense. They were including him in a moment of genuine cultural sharing where humor served as a bridge between different ways of life. The most remarkable aspect of the situation was how the laughter enhanced rather than diminished the cultural significance of the moment. The throat singers were demonstrating that their art form was not a museum piece to be preserved unchanged, but a living tradition that could incorporate new experiences and observations while maintaining its essential character and techniques. Camilla's laughter became particularly pronounced when Siku began incorporating what appeared to be her interpretation of royal protocol. The careful way distinguished visitors were escorted from place to place, the polite pauses for photographs, and the diplomatic language used to describe everything as fascinating and wonderful. Her gentle mockery was so affectionate and accurate that even the most formal community officials began laughing. The children in the audience were delighted to see the adults, including the visiting royalty, behaving with such spontaneous joy. Many of them had never seen throat singing performed with such playful elements, and they began to understand that their cultural traditions could be both serious and fun, both ancient and contemporary. The teenagers, who had initially attended the presentation more out of obligation than interest, found themselves genuinely engaged for the first time. Seeing throat singing used as a form of observational comedy made them reconsider their assumptions about traditional art forms. Several would later approach Siku and Tepeza about learning the techniques themselves. Elder Kanguk watched the proceedings with deep satisfaction. She remembered throat singing sessions from her childhood where similar spontaneous humor had erupted, bringing communities together in shared laughter during the long, dark winter months. The fact that this ancient function was working perfectly with visitors from another culture confirmed her belief that some aspects of human nature transcended all boundaries. The performance reached its comedic peak when both women began a collaborative piece that seemed to chronicle the entire morning's events from multiple perspectives. They incorporated the sounds of aircraft engines, the crunch of snow underfoot, the whoosh of car doors opening and closing, and what could only be interpreted as diplomatic conversations conducted through translators. Their final collaborative sound was clearly meant to represent the moment when formal protocol dissolved into genuine human connection. The throat singing gradually transformed from structured cultural presentation into something that sounded remarkably like a group of friends sharing stories and laughing together around a kitchen table. Charles wiped tears from his eyes as the improvised performance began to wind down. He had experienced many cultural presentations during his decades of royal duties, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. The throat singers had managed to educate him about their art form, entertain him thoroughly, and make him feel genuinely welcome in their community all at the same time. Camilla was equally moved by the experience, though her emotional response went beyond simple entertainment. She recognized that she had just witnessed something rare and precious, a moment where cultural barriers had completely dissolved, where traditional art had served its ancient function of bringing people together, and where laughter had created genuine understanding between strangers. The entire community center was now filled with the sounds of appreciation and joy. People were wiping tears from their eyes, sharing observations about the performance with their neighbors, and expressing amazement at the skill and creativity the two women had displayed. The formal atmosphere of a royal cultural presentation had been replaced by something that felt more like a community celebration. As Siku and Tepeza finally concluded their extraordinary performance, the community center erupted in sustained applause that lasted several minutes. Charles and Camilla rose from their seats along with the rest of the audience, their faces still flushed with laughter and clearly moved by what they had experienced. The king approached the two performers with obvious enthusiasm, abandoning the formal handshake protocol in favor of expressing genuine appreciation for their artistry and humor. Elder Kanguk made her way forward to explain that the playful turn the performance had taken was not unusual for traditional throat singing sessions. She described how, in the old days, women would gather during the long Arctic nights, not just for serious cultural preservation, but for entertainment and community bonding. The ability to make others laugh while demonstrating technical skill was considered one of the highest forms of the art. Charles listened intently as the elder explained that what he and Camilla had just witnessed represented throat singing at its most authentic, not as a formal presentation for outsiders, but as a living tradition that responded to immediate circumstances and included everyone present in the creative process. The king expressed his amazement at how the ancient art form had been used to comment on contemporary cross-cultural encounters while maintaining its essential character. Camilla spent considerable time speaking with both Siku and Tepeza about their training and their work to revitalize throat singing throughout Nunavut. She learned that both women were part of a network of young Inuit artists who were working to ensure that traditional practices would not only survive, but continue to evolve and remain relevant to new generations. Their willingness to incorporate humor and contemporary observations into ancient forms was part of a broader cultural movement throughout the Arctic. The Queen Consort was particularly interested in learning about the role of women in preserving and transmitting Inuit culture. Tepeza explained that throat singing had been primarily a women's art form, and that its near disappearance during the residential school era had represented a significant loss of female cultural knowledge and bonding practices. The current revival was being led primarily by women who understood that cultural preservation required both respect for tradition and willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. As word of the remarkable performance spread through the small community, more people began arriving at the community center, hoping to meet the royal visitors and perhaps witness additional cultural presentations. The formal schedule for the day was quietly abandoned as the event transformed into an impromptu community gathering where people of all ages shared stories, demonstrated traditional skills, and continued the conversation that the throat singing performance had initiated. Charles found himself in animated discussions with local hunters about traditional knowledge of Arctic wildlife and weather patterns. His longtime interest in environmental conservation provided common ground for conversations about climate change impacts on traditional hunting practices and the sophisticated understanding of ecosystem relationships that Inuit knowledge had preserved for generations. Several young people approached Charles and Camilla to share their own experiences with cultural revival efforts. They described how social media and modern communication technologies were being used to connect young Inuit across the vast distances of the Arctic, sharing traditional knowledge and creating new forms of cultural expression that built upon ancient foundations. The impact of the morning's events extended far beyond the immediate audience. Video recordings of portions of the throat singing performance, particularly the moments when Charles and Camilla burst into laughter, began circulating on social media platforms within hours. The images of the royal couple genuinely enjoying themselves while learning about Inuit culture resonated with people around the world who were hungry for authentic cultural exchange. For the Iqaluit community, the event represented a significant success in their ongoing efforts to share Inuit culture with the broader world on their own terms. Rather than presenting themselves as curiosities or relics from the past, they had demonstrated that their traditional practices remained vibrant, relevant, and capable of creating genuine connections with people from very different backgrounds. Siku and Tepeza became minor celebrities throughout the Arctic region as news of their performance spread through Inuit communities across Canada. They received invitations to perform at cultural festivals, educational institutions, and other events where their combination of traditional skill and contemporary creativity could reach new audiences. The long-term significance of the event became clear in the months that followed. The throat singing performance and the royal couple's enthusiastic response helped generate increased interest in Inuit cultural programs, additional funding for Indigenous arts education, and greater recognition of the sophisticated artistic traditions that had developed in the Arctic over thousands of years. For Charles and Camilla personally, the experience became a touchstone for authentic cultural engagement during their reign. They frequently referenced the morning in Iqaluit when discussing the importance of approaching different cultures with openness, humor, and genuine curiosity rather than formal distance. The throat singing performance had demonstrated that meaningful cultural exchange required vulnerability and willingness to be surprised by joy. Years later, when asked about their most memorable cultural experiences as monarchs, both Charles and Camilla would inevitably mention the morning they burst into laughter at Inuit throat singing. The event had shown them that genuine respect for other cultures sometimes meant being willing to abandon protocol in favor of authentic human connection. The community center in Iqaluit eventually installed a small plaque commemorating the visit, but the real memorial to the event lived in the memories of everyone who had witnessed two ancient art forms, throat singing and monarchy, discovering their shared capacity for bringing people together through the universal language of laughter and mutual appreciation. The story became part of local oral tradition, told and retold with growing embellishment as the years passed, but always emphasizing the central truth that had made the mornings so special. That genuine cultural sharing requires openness to surprise, willingness to laugh at oneself, and recognition that human creativity and humor transcend all boundaries of language, tradition, and social position.